My name is Whitney Howarth, and I'm a professor of world history at Plymouth State University. I've been teaching about Rwanda for about 16 years now, and I had the opportunity to go to Rwanda this past February, end of February, early March, for about 12 days. And to be a professor of history and to teach out of a textbook and watch videos and share that with students is powerful when you're teaching genocide, which happened in Rwanda in 1994, 26 years ago. But to actually go to a place where genocide happened and also to meet people whose lives were deeply impacted by that trauma is a very profound experience. Rwandan, just to tell you, was a site of many ethnic massacres throughout the early 20th century, and a civil war that started in 1990 and went to the end of 94. And part of that war was a genocide of Hutu against Tutsi. And about 800,000 people were slaughtered in about 100 days. So I remember my first morning waking up in my 3-star hotel in Rwanda with my friend, overlooking the gorgeous city of Kigali, the capital. And I remember watching movies like Hotel Rwanda and other films which portrayed every single street in that capital city awash in blood. And I'm sitting on my balcony sipping tea, looking at the sunshine and this peaceful, beautiful, modern, clean city, just kind of in awe that so much loss and death and trauma had happened there. You know, even I think to the point of trying to imagine what it was like to be on that balcony in 1994 and hear the gunshots and hear the people. And it was a big part of my trip in Rwanda to reconcile what was such a beautiful country and such warm, friendly people with the knowledge I had of the genocide in my head. And, you know, reflecting on the lessons that I've received from my trip to Rwanda and meeting Rwandans, I think one of the big themes that came out for me was resilience. And trying to understand collective as well as individual resilience after a massive trauma, a national trauma, like a genocide. And so the first and most important lesson I learned about resilience was that bearing witness to the pain and the loss and the trauma is so hard, but also so necessary for people to move forward. When I went to the Genocide Memorial Museum in the capital, which one of the main reasons I wanted to go to Rwanda was to go to that museum. And it's very well done, very powerful experience walking through the exhibits. But what I wasn't prepared for was that memorial was also the site of a graveyard for 259,000 Rwandans. And the person I think of, the symbol I think of when I think of Rwandan resilience is our guide, Norbert, who was with us for that trip and for that day. And he gave us a rose at the entrance of the museum. And as we went through the exhibit, we're holding our rose, not sure what we're doing with it. And then at the end, we go out into the garden where there's just big slabs. And he said, place a rose on these graves. And he had told us a story of his sister, Chantal, who had been raped and who had been murdered in his house in front of him and his family. And we placed that rose and said her name. And in that garden, there was also a wall of names. And it felt so important to bear witness to the names of those that had been lost. You know, many of you maybe have been to the Vietnam War Memorial or to the 9/11 Memorial. And so the first lesson of resilience that I found was saying the names of the lost and bearing witness, and then also hearing the stories, the personal stories that sometimes get lost when we study it or teach it, you know, in textbooks. And so that lesson of resilience for me made me think, but how do people get past that part of the story? How do you get past the pain? And so the trip went on and we visited many towns all throughout Rwanda, and every hilltop and every town had a sign, memorial, And we would just turn to Norbert and say, how many here? And he'd say 58,000. And Rwanda is about the size of New Hampshire. It's about 12 million people. It's very densely concentrated. Then we go to the next town, and he'd say, 28,000 buried here. And so the last stop on the last day of our trip was to Norbert's family's house, which was a tiny little house in a very poor neighborhood of old Rwanda. His father had been a judge before the genocide and after. And this is where I learned my second lesson of resilience is after you bear witness and you face the pain and you talk about the pain, you have to forgive. And you have to forgive whatever is coming up for you in the trauma and what other suffering, others have caused. And I don't know that I could be a person that could forgive after such loss, but we met Norbert's father, who had also been a judge after the genocide in these hearings called the Kajaja courts. And he was facing people as a judge in the court, literally, that had tried to kill his family and maybe had been involved in his daughter's death. And when I asked him, what is this about Rwandans? How can they recover? How can they find reconciliation? How can they start over? He's a Catholic man of great faith, and his faith has taught him to forgive. And I said, but, what does it look like? You can say, I forgive you, my soul is healing, I wish you well. And he said, working together with people from the other side. And he introduced me to a Catholic priest named Father Theogene, who is doing that work with youth in Rwanda today. He is actually bringing Hutu and Tutsi children, born after the genocide, most of them, to do community projects, to start learning how to make business plans and acquire entrepreneurial skills to start businesses, which is very important. Rwandans faced a devastating economic situation after the genocide that went on for about a decade. And I think about, people who survived the war in World War II in Germany. I think about the devastation that's going to probably be something we face after COVID-19 is over. This desperate, fearful economic depression. And what Norbert's father and Theogene said is people who survived just had to, put their nose to the grindstone, just had to say, I need to work with Hutus and Tutsis. I need to get my business up. I need to put food on the table for my children. And so that sense of purpose and that sense of drive and that sense of we can't wallow. We really don't have the luxury, just existentially, to sit and just bear witness or just tell the stories or just feel the sadness. We have to do that, and then we have to get to the next step. And I also think, in terms of resilience, that gave Rwandans hope that not only were they going to face a very different world than they had pre-war, pre-genocide, but that world could be better, that world could offer people a new way of being. And so one of the Rwandans who actually lives here in Concord, who works with the Overcomers Refugee Service Organization, and he's the elder at the Overcomers Church. His name is Clement Kegugu. And I spoke with Clement recently after my trip. I asked him the same question, what does resilience look like for Rwandans? What does it mean to actually rebuild a society, reimagine a new world? And what's interesting about Clement is he wasn't present in Rwanda, even though he's Rwandan, for the genocide. He was living in the Congo. And then he came to Rwanda right after, in 94, right after the genocide. And he worked with HIV, AIDS patients, and orphans and widows. Pretty much everyone, if you can imagine, lost someone in that genocide. Every single family was touched. And he said the same thing that Father Theogene said. He said, we just had to figure out how to work together and not hold resentment and not try to retaliate and not worry about that, that past, but to try to rebuild a world that we wanted to live in. And so for me, I think having hope and not just, sort of a touchy-feely, oh, I hope things will be better, but really believing that there is a purpose and a meaning and a necessity to work hard together to rebuild. That's so important. The other piece of resilience that, is interesting, coming back from Rwanda and coming back and getting sick myself and seeing COVID-19, the other piece that struck me was a willingness for people to look for the benefits or the gratitude or the moments of growth in their own lives through this trauma, right? And I think it's part of a spiritual practice that I try to cultivate. And it's so hard. It's so hard to be grateful. But coming back from Rwanda, I kind of felt guilty not being grateful for every little thing. Because as wonderfully developed and economically secure now, that Rwandans are now, they still face hardships that we, in the privileged American world, America and the North, cannot imagine. And so I saw in Rwandans, this gratitude for family, this gratitude for community, at a level that I don't think I've ever seen, except for maybe in some of my experiences in India. So what a lesson to come back with, and, to sit here in my house. I have a job, I have health, I have a home, I have green forest outside my window. And I just think resilience requires us not just to have gratitude, but to actively and consistently look for benefits and purpose and moments of understanding how grateful and how safe we are. Community and connection and family. There are people who are resilient who don't have those things, but I think for many of us, we need those things to be truly resilient. And the last lesson, and it's not necessarily Rwandan, but it's a thought about renewal and rebirth and the possibility of that. My very favorite social science education professor, Dr. Mayer from college, wrote recently during Passover about his Seder. He's like, this is such a weird moment. We're Zooming our Seder. But he said, and he's a history person too. He went through history and he said, Jews have always adapted and always found rebirth after their adaptation. Rebirth is an opportunity, right? Of renewal, an opportunity of having something even better than we had before. And I think if you are resilient, you have to believe in that. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about in the last few weeks. And the last story or piece I wanted to share, again, was about my friend Norbert, who was our guide in Rwanda. He was more than a guide, though. He's the in-country director of this company my friend owns, and she's encouraging people to go to Rwanda, to trek, to meet people, to study the history. And Norbert had the opportunity when he was in college. He met Jack Hanna, the famous wildlife celebrity and zookeeper, and he got an invitation from Jack Hanna to come to America when he was a young man and go to college and work at the Ohio Zoo. And this is Norbert who was 10 years old and saw the most horrific atrocities. And all he wanted to do was have this, experience of being a zookeeper in America, and his dream come true. But what he remembers about America was that during that time, studying for that year, he fell upon a deep depression, thinking about the things he had lost and, being surrounded by privilege and comfort. And he went to a therapist for the first time. And counseling is not a part of Rwandan culture. And talking about your private innermost feelings and your family is not a part of Rwandan culture. And yet he did, and he was able to face his trauma. He was bearing witness, he was sharing his pain, he was talking about what he's done in his life. He's a hardworking, dedicated person to overcome the trauma. And still his counselor said, there's so much more you will have to process. There's so much, and this may take years. And it's okay. It's okay that it's not like one shot. one-stop shopping. You know, it's not one therapy session or even 12 that's going to heal you. Healing takes time. And Norbert came back to Rwanda and as a guide is doing amazing things. And when I asked him at the end of our trip, like, what does he dream about for his own future? He said, I want to become a therapist. I want to help other people face their trauma. I want to help Rwandans talk about what they saw and what they experienced. And I want to make people feel that that's okay and that they can bear witness and also move on, that you can feel pain and sorrow and loss and also be strong at the same time. And I thought, well, here's resilience. Norbert's belief that even though it was foreign to his culture, that people could share their trauma and heal together. It's a pretty powerful story of resilience. So those are my thoughts on Rwanda. I'll be happy to chat more about my experiences in the country or about the history to anyone that's interested. And as we face our own collective and individual challenges during this time, I hope we continue to be resilient and to support each other in bearing witness to our pain and also in the healing and renewal that will come. Thanks.